Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today, we're diving into a tense new twist. While Yuri is away, Lin turns the whole public against Mrs. Nghia, and a single leaked document could destroy her reputation and her company overnight. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. Morning didn't arrive gently. It came with a cold wind and a phone that wouldn't stop buzzing. Tu Tieu sat at the kitchen table with Mrs. Nghia, both of them tired from the night before. The hidden recording was saved. The submission log was tucked safely away. They should have felt relief, like they had finally grabbed something solid. But Lin wasn't the kind of enemy who panicked when caught. She was the kind who changed weapons. Mrs. Nghyia's phone vibrated again, then again, and again. She glanced down, her face tightening. So many calls. Tu Tieu leaned in. From who? Mrs. Nghyia's lips parted slightly. Board members, old friends, even cousins I haven't spoken to in years. Tu Tieu's stomach sank. That's not normal. Then Tu Tieu's own phone buzzed. Message after message from neighbours near the market. Is it true about Mrs. Nghia? People are saying she stole family property. Someone posted about the company. Reporters are asking questions. Tu Tieu looked up, eyes sharpening. Cool. Lin isn't trying to win with documents today. Mrs. Nghia swallowed. Then how? Tu Tieu's voice turned low. She's trying to destroy your name. As if the universe wanted to confirm it, the TV in the corner suddenly flashed a local news segment, one of those quick morning reports about community concerns. No names yet, but the words were there. A family dispute. A large business. Questions of rightful ownership. Public outrage. Mrs. Nghyia's hands began to shake. Tu Tieu grabbed the remote and lowered the volume, but the damage was already done. Once a rumour reaches the public, it doesn't need proof. It only needs repetition. Mrs. Nghia whispered, If people believe that, then the board... They'll pressure you, Tu Tieu finished. They'll claim they must protect the company. Mrs. Nghyia's eyes filled. I've spent my whole life building it. Tu Tieu reached for her hand. Then we protect it. But first, we stay calm. A sharp knock hit the front door. Both women froze. Tu Tieu stood slowly, moved to the window and peeked through the curtain. Two people stood outside. One held a phone up like a camera. The other held a small microphone. Reporters. Tu Tieu's blood ran cold. Don't open, she whispered. Mrs. Nghyia's breath came in quick bursts. How did they find my house? Tu Tieu didn't answer because she already knew. Someone wanted them here. Someone wanted a scene. The knocking came again, louder. Mrs. Nghia, we only need a quick comment. Tu Tieu pulled Mrs. Nghia away from the living room and into the back hallway. Ko, breathe. Stay out of sight. Mrs. Nghyia's voice cracked. If I hide, they'll say I'm guilty. If you speak while emotional, they'll twist your words, Tu Tieu said firmly. Right now, silence is safer. The reporters kept knocking for another minute, then finally left. But the air didn't return to normal. It stayed heavy, like the house itself had been labelled. An hour later, they arrived at the company, and the tension there was worse. Employees were whispering near the lobby. People stopped talking when Mrs. Nghia entered, then quickly looked away. Not respectful, uncertain, afraid. That kind of fear spreads like smoke. A manager approached quickly, face strained. Mrs. Nghia, the board called an emergency meeting. Mrs. Nghyia's voice was stiff. About what? The manager hesitated. About reputation risk. They say investors are nervous. Vendors are calling. Social media is trending. Mrs. Nghia blinked as if the words didn't belong in her life. Trending? Tu Tieu felt anger rise in her chest. Lin had taken an old woman's private life and thrown it into the street like garbage. They entered the meeting room. The board members were already seated, faces stern, tight with that corporate look that pretends to be neutral, but actually means one thing: protect yourself first. A man at the head of the table cleared his throat. Mrs. Nghia, thank you for coming. Mrs. Nghia sat slowly, spine straight. "You called this meeting. Speak." Another board member slid a tablet across the table. On it were screenshots of posts, blurred faces, dramatic captions, angry comments. No hard evidence, just outrage. "People are alleging," the board member said carefully, "that the company's assets were acquired through improper ownership transfer, a family dispute." Mrs. Nghier's hands clenched under the table. "Alleging based on what?" The man at the head sighed. "That's the problem. The story is spreading faster than facts." A woman board member leaned in. "Mrs. Nghia, with all respect, your personal reputation is now tied to the company's stability. If the public believes this narrative, banks may review us, partners may distance themselves." Tu Tieu spoke up before Mrs. Nghia could be cornered. "This is a smear campaign." The room went still. Several board members glanced at her like she was an interruption. The man at the head spoke politely, but his tone sharpened. "Miss, this is a board meeting." Tu Tieu didn't back down. "Then listen like board members. Someone is using public outrage to force you into panic decisions. This is not about truth, it's about pressure." A board member frowned. "Do you have evidence?" Tu Tieu's heart pounded. She did have evidence, the recording, the log, Lin's confession. But she also knew something. If she played the recording too early, Lin would claim it was illegal, edited, trapped. And the board might get scared of scandal and still move against Mrs. Nghia. So Tu Tieu chose her words carefully. "We have proof someone tried to manipulate signatures and documents," she said. "We are working with internal compliance to secure the system." That sentence made several board members shift uncomfortably. "Manipulate signatures?" one repeated. Mrs. Nghia finally spoke, voice low but steady. "I did not steal anything. I did not forge anything. Someone is trying to destroy me while Yuri is away." At the mention of Yuri, the man at the head looked down. Yuri's absence is part of the concern. The public sees vulnerability. A board member leaned forward. "Mrs. Nghia, until this is resolved, we may need to appoint an interim spokesperson, someone to handle public relations and reassure stakeholders." Mrs. Nghier's eyes widened. "You want to take my voice?" "Not take," the man corrected gently. "Protect. Reduce risk." Tu Tieu felt her stomach drop. This was Lin's plan. Not to steal shares in silence, but to force the board to isolate Mrs. Nghia and then move the assets for safety, Mrs. Nghier's lips trembled. "If you silence me, you make me look guilty." The woman board member gave a sympathetic look that felt fake. "Public opinion isn't fair, Mrs. Nghia. We have to manage perception." And then the door opened. A staff member whispered to the manager. The manager's face went pale and turned to the board. "Sir, reporters are downstairs, and there are protesters outside the building." Mrs. Nghier's breath caught. Tu Tieu's eyes flashed. "Protesters?" The manager nodded shakily. "They're holding signs, they're chanting, they're demanding an explanation." Mrs. Nghia looked like she might collapse again, but Tu Tieu reached over and squeezed her hand hard, grounding her. Then Tu Tieu leaned closer and whispered, "Ko, Lin is trying to force you to step down." Mrs. Nghia whispered back, voice breaking, "And if I don't?" Tu Tieu's gaze hardened. "Then she'll make this louder." Outside, the chants grew clearer through the glass, and downstairs cameras waited like teeth. Mrs. Nghia stared forward, and in her eyes was a terrifying realization. This wasn't just a legal fight anymore, it was a public execution. And Lin had planned the crowd. The lobby didn't feel like a workplace anymore. It felt like a courtroom. The moment Mrs. Nghia and Tu Tieu stepped out of the meeting room, noise swallowed them. Camera shutters snapping, phones held high, voices calling her name as if they could drag her out by syllables alone. "Mrs. Nghia, did you steal the shares? Is the company built on stolen property? Will you step down? Who signed the transfer papers?" Mrs. Nghia stopped mid-step. Her face tightened, eyes glistening with a mix of shock and insult. Her hand lifted instinctively like she wanted to speak, like she wanted to explain. because in her world, if you told the truth clearly enough, people listened. But this crowd wasn't here to listen. They were here to feed. Tu Tieu stepped in front of her fast, shielding her with her body. "Please give her space," she said firmly. "There will be an official statement." A reporter shoved a microphone forward. "So you admit something happened?" Another voice from behind the cameras barked, "Later means never." The word thief floated through the air, one ugly syllable that made Mrs. Nghia flinch like she'd been slapped. Tu Tieu tightened her grip on Mrs. Nghia's wrist and guided her toward a side corridor. "Ko, don't speak here," she whispered. "Not while they're hungry." Mrs. Nghia's breathing turned fast and shallow. "If I don't speak, they'll think I'm guilty." "If you speak now," Tu Tieu murmured, "they'll twist everything you say and make it worse. That's what Lin wants." They turned the corner, but the chaos followed like a tide. Even employees in the hallway were staring, some sympathetic, some frightened, and some just watching like this was entertainment. A security guard appeared, sweating. "Mrs. Nghia, this way, private exit, please." Mrs. Nghia's lips trembled. "This is my company, and I'm being escorted like a criminal." Tu Tieu's voice stayed gentle but unbreakable. "You're being protected because someone wants a scene. Don't give it to them." Then, from the edge of the lobby, a familiar voice cut through the noise like a knife through cloth. "See," it said lightly, "this is what happens when you hide." Tu Tieu's stomach dropped before she even turned. Lin stood there, perfectly dressed, perfectly calm, positioned just far enough to look uninvolved and close enough to enjoy every second. Her expression wasn't worried. It wasn't angry. It was satisfied, like she was watching a story she had written unfold exactly as planned. "Mrs." Nghia stared at her, disbelief breaking into pain. "You?" Lin gave a small, polite smile. "Ko Nghia, I warned you. Reputation doesn't wait." Tu Tieu stepped forward, blocking Lin's line of sight to Mrs. Nghia. "You brought reporters to her home." Lin blinked slowly, performing innocence. "I didn't bring anyone. People talk. When there's smoke, they look for fire." Tu Tieu's eyes hardened. "You lit the smoke." Lin's smile thinned for a split second, just enough to show the sharpness underneath. "Prove it," she whispered. That was the cruelty of Lin's new weapon. She didn't need proof to destroy someone, but to stop destruction, you needed proof strong enough to survive panic and politics. The head board member rushed over, face tight. "Mrs. Nghia, security confirms protesters are outside. We need to move you to a secure room. Now." Mrs. Nghia's throat tightened. "Protesters?" He nodded. "They're chanting, holding signs, demanding a statement." Lin sighed softly, like she was watching something sad but inevitable. "This is why I offered quiet help," she told Mrs. Nghia, voice sweet as poison. "But you didn't listen." Mrs. Nghia's eyes welled. "Help? You're tearing me apart." Lin leaned closer, lowering her voice. "No, Ko. I'm revealing truth. People deserve to know." Tu Tieu didn't argue further in the hallway. Hallways had ears. Lin loved ears. "Take us," Tu Tieu said to the board member. "Now, and don't let her follow." Lin chuckled. "I'm not following. I'm already everywhere." The secure room was small and sterile under fluorescent lights. It was meant to be safe, but it felt like a place you put someone when you didn't know what else to do with them. A few board members filed in, a manager, a security guard at the door. Mrs. Nghia sat at the end of the table, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles looked pale. Tu Tieu stood beside her like a pillar. Outside, the chanting was still faintly audible through the walls, muffled, relentless, like a heartbeat that wouldn't stop. The head board member exhaled hard. "We need a decision," he said. "Public pressure is escalating. If we do nothing..." "If you react the way Lin wants," Tu Tieu interrupted, "you hand her the company." The head board member frowned. "Miss Tu Tieu, you're not on the board." Tu Tieu met his eyes without blinking. "And yet, I'm the only one in this room who sees the trap clearly." That statement chilled the room into silence. Mrs. Nghia's voice trembled. "They want me to step down." A woman board member spoke carefully, trying to sound compassionate. Not permanently. We're discussing an interim spokesperson, someone to handle public relations while this is investigated. Mrs. Nghia looked at her, hurt bleeding into anger. Protect the company by taking my voice? The woman's eyes flickered. Public perception is fragile. Tu Tieu's tone turned firm. Public perception is being manufactured. Lin is weaponizing outrage to isolate Mrs. Nghia. Once she looks guilty and alone, Lin offers the solution, a takeover dressed up as stability. The head board member rubbed his forehead. Do you have proof this is coordinated? Tu Tieu felt her heart pound. This was the moment she'd been holding back for. If she used the recording now, the board might finally move. If she waited, they might make a temporary decision that became permanent. She glanced at Mrs. Nghia. Mrs. Nghier's eyes were wet but steady, like she was begging for a chance to fight rather than be quietly erased. Tu Tieu nodded once. Yes, she said. I have proof. A few board members shifted. The air sharpened. Tu Tieu placed her phone on the table and slid it forward. This was recorded last night in Mrs. Nghier's home. Lin didn't know. Mrs. Nghia inhaled sharply. Tu Tieu kept her voice gentle. Ko, this is protection, not shame. Then she pressed play. Lin's voice filled the room, calm, controlled, chilling. Uri leaves. You're alone. You're tired. Of course I planned it. A collective inhale rippled across the table, then Lin again, almost amused. Truth doesn't matter when a story is useful. The headboard member's face drained of colour, and then the line that made the room go truly still. Someone inside, someone smart enough to follow instructions. Tu Tieu stopped the audio. Silence slammed down like a locked door. She looked around the table one by one. Now you can stop calling this rumours, she said softly. This is sabotage. The woman board member whispered. She admitted she planned public pressure. A manager leaned forward, alarmed. If she has an insider, our document systems are compromised. Mrs. Nghier's voice broke, but it held strength now. Then stop treating me like the problem. Treat Lin like the threat. No one argued, not this time. The headboard member straightened. We need immediate action, he said, voice tight. We will issue a statement within the hour. The company is investigating coordinated misinformation and internal misconduct. We'll notify our banks and key partners. We'll secure access. Tu Tieu didn't relax. And Mrs. Nghier's role? A pause. For now, he said carefully, she remains chairwoman. Tu Tieu's gaze sharpened. For now? He looked uncomfortable. Public pressure is powerful. Mrs. Nghier's hands clenched. So my position depends on strangers yelling outside? It depends on stability, he replied. And stability depends on confidence. Tu Tieu's voice turned colder. Then we build confidence by naming this a coordinated attack, not by hiding Mrs. Nghia like she's guilty. He nodded, forced to accept it. Then the security guard knocked quickly and entered, breathless. Sir, reporters are demanding a response. The crowd is growing. And there's another problem. The room tensed instantly. What? The headboard member demanded. The guard swallowed. Part of the audio is online. Tu Tieu's blood turned ice cold. Mrs. Nghia whispered, Online? The guard nodded. A clip. Not the full recording, but it's spreading. Tu Tieu's mind raced. She hadn't shared it. She hadn't sent it. She had only played it here. Which meant the insider Lin bragged about wasn't a ghost. It was active and bold. The headboard member's face tightened. Who leaked it? The guard shook his head. We don't know yet. Tu Tieu stared at the board members. Now do you understand? She said quietly. Every delay gives Lin time to plant another lie, and your own building may be helping her. Before anyone could respond, another staff member rushed in holding a tablet, hands shaking. Sir, Lin posted something new. He turned the screen toward them. A scanned document was circulating, stamped, formatted, terrifyingly convincing. Even without reading the fine print, the layout screamed legitimacy. The comments beneath it were furious. Mrs. Nghia's face drained. She's making fake evidence. The headboard member's jaw clenched. We need legal action. Tu Tieu's phone buzzed in her palm. Unknown number. Nice try. Now watch what I post next. Tu Tieu didn't flinch, but her eyes darkened. Mrs. Nghia whispered, "She won't stop." "She won't," Tu Tieu said, voice steady, "because she's not trying to win one argument. She's building a story so loud that truth can't breathe." The headboard member swallowed. "What do you want us to do?" Tu Tieu answered instantly, like she'd been holding the plan in her chest all morning. "Lock down internal access, freeze suspicious accounts, pull CCTV, audit every login, find the insider, and issue a statement now, today, naming this coordinated misinformation." The board members exchanged uneasy looks, then nodded, because now they had heard Lin confess with their own ears. Outside, the chanting shifted again, confusion mixing with anger, anger demanding more. The crowd didn't calm down, it only got hungrier. The headboard member stood. "We'll draft the statement immediately." Tu Tieu grabbed his attention with a sharp look. "And don't say no comment. If you hide, she wins." He nodded, grim. "Understood." Mrs. Nghia sat very still, staring at the tablet like it was a weapon pointed at her face. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "I built this company with my own hands, and now strangers are deciding my worth." Tu Tieu squeezed her shoulder. "Not strangers," she corrected softly. "Lin, and whoever she owns inside this building." Far away in another country, Yuri's phone flickered with a brief signal, just a blink of connection in the middle of his busy day. A breaking news notification appeared. Mrs. Nghia accused of stealing company shares. Yuri's heart dropped. His fingers moved fast, trying to call home, but the signal died again. The screen went dark. Uri stood frozen, thousands of miles away, feeling the rope connecting him to his mother and his company snapping tighter with every second he couldn't reach them. Back in the secure room, Tu Tieu watched the board scramble into action, watched security move, watched panic turn into motion, but her gut stayed heavy, because Lin didn't sound defeated. She sounded entertained, like this was only the beginning, and tomorrow she planned to make the story even louder.